February 2021. A storm nobody in Texas saw coming, or more accurately, a storm everybody saw coming and nobody actually prepared for. Drop temperatures in Austin to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not a typo. 2 degrees Fahrenheit in Austin, Texas. The power grid failed. People huddled in their bedrooms under every blanket they owned. They lit tea candles under flower pots because someone on Facebook said that worked. It doesn't. A tea light produces around 30 watts of heat, and your average bedroom needs about 1,500 to move the needle. But physics doesn't care what's trending. At least 246 people died. Some of them were found in their own beds, in their own homes, surrounded by furniture and walls and roofs, and they died anyway. 3 weeks before that storm, a 58-year-old man named Ruben Salcido was sleeping in a structure he'd built from scavenged corrugated steel panels, rigid foam insulation boards he'd pulled from a construction dumpster off I-35, and 2 layers of heavy contractor tarp wedged into the concrete cutout under the Lamar Boulevard pedestrian bridge on the north edge of Town Lake. He had no power. He had no furnace. He had no HOA, no mortgage. No insulation contractor who'd certified his walls met code. What he had was a sleeping platform built 6 inches off the ground surface, a north-facing wall blocked by a stacked pallet barricade, and an interior space small enough that his own body heat could actually matter. When the storm hit, the temperature inside his shelter never dropped below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The houses killed people. His cardboard and foam kept him alive. I'm not telling you this to romanticize what Ruben was going through. Sleeping outside in Austin in February is not a lifestyle choice anyone makes on purpose, and Ruben would tell you the same thing. But there's something that happened inside that concrete cutout, something that happened in his choices about where to put the foam, which direction to face the opening, how small to make the interior that is worth slowing down and actually looking at. Because the thing Ruben knew, and the thing most of the people who died in their heated houses apparently did not know, goes back a long way. It goes back to a field manual. It goes back to a curriculum. It goes back to a branch of the United States military that spent decades figuring out exactly how heat leaves a human body and exactly what you can do about it with whatever you can find on the ground. Ruben Salcido spent 9 years as a combat engineer in the Army. He deployed twice, once to Kuwait in 1998, once to Iraq in 2003. He came home from the second one with a hearing aid in his left ear, a knee that's never been right since a vehicle rollover outside Tikrit, and a working knowledge of cold weather survival that he carried in his head like a set of instructions he never asked to memorize but couldn't forget. This is the story of what he knew, where it came from, and why in February 2021, in Austin, Texas, that knowledge was the difference between alive and not. Ruben is a compact man, about 5'9", with the kind of shoulders that suggest he did a lot of physical work for a long time and then stopped, so they're still broad but softened at the edges. He has close-cropped gray hair, almost silver now. He started going gray at 38, and a thick mustache that curves down around the corners of his mouth, mostly gray too, with some dark brown still holding on near the middle. His hands are what you notice first, honestly. Knuckles that have been through things. A scar across the base of his right thumb from a sheet metal edge in 2019, when he was still doing day labor at a fabrication yard off Airport Boulevard. He grew up in San Antonio, joined at 22. His MOS, military occupational specialty, was 12B, combat engineer, which means his job in the Army was to build things fast and destroy things faster. Bridges, obstacles, breaching charges for doors, and, when the situation called for it, field shelters, structures that had to work in terrain that didn't cooperate, with materials that were never meant for the job, under conditions that punished every wrong decision immediately. After Iraq, he got out at 31, did 11 years in construction, mostly commercial framing, and then some concrete work. That ended in 2018 when the knee got bad enough that he couldn't be on a ladder or a scaffold reliably anymore, and the company he was with, a mid-size contractor off Ben White Boulevard, let him go. Savings lasted 8 months. He lost the apartment in October 2019. By November, he was sleeping in the truck. By March 2020, the truck was gone too, repossessed while he was at a day labor hall trying to pick up a shift. He'd been outside for almost 2 years by the time the storm hit. Here's what most people don't understand about cold, And I mean really don't understand, not in a way that just sounds like a fact, but in a way that would actually change what you do. The air in your bedroom is not what's trying to kill you. The floor is. The Army figured this out the hard way during Korea, watching soldiers freeze in temperatures that shouldn't have been fatal, and the conclusion they arrived at got written into FM 3-0570, the Army Survival Field Manual, in a line that every soldier who's been through cold weather training can quote back. When at rest, you lose as much as 80% of your body heat to the ground. 80% to the ground, not to the wind, not to the cold air around you, but to the surface you're lying on. The reason is thermal conductivity. Still air, the air just sitting in your bedroom right now, conducts heat at about 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin. That's nearly nothing. Air is a terrible conductor. That's why insulation works at all. Insulation is mostly just trapped air, organized so it can't move. But soil conducts heat at somewhere between 0.15 and 2 watts per meter Kelvin, depending on how much moisture is in it. Wet soil hits 4. Concrete runs higher than dry soil. What that means in practice is that the ground is pulling heat out of your body somewhere between 6 and 100 times faster than the air above you is. You can pile every blanket you own on top of yourself, and it will not matter if the surface beneath you is bare concrete, because 80% of your heat is leaving through the bottom, and your blankets are covering the wrong surface. The people who knew this, who had been trained to know this, didn't freeze. The people who didn't know it, some of them stacked 4 comforters on top of themselves in a house that had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit and still died. Not because 38 degrees Fahrenheit is unsurvivable, it's not, but because without something insulating between them and the floor won the heat battle every time. Ruben knew this the way he knew how to operate a bolt cutter, not because he'd thought carefully about it, but because someone had drilled it into him at Fort Leonard Wood in 1993, and the information had just stayed there. When he lost the truck in March 2020, the first thing he built before he found the Lamar Bridge spot, before he had the foam boards, was a sleeping platform out of 4 wooden pallets he pulled from behind a grocery store on South Congress. He wasn't sure those pallets were going to help. He was actually a little skeptical, because they had gaps in them and it was cold, and gaps seemed like bad news. But the training in his head said, get off the ground. It doesn't matter how, just get off the ground. So he put the pallets down. He slept on the pallets. And then he understood physically, in his own body, why the training was right. The pallets were cold, but the night air moving through the gaps in the pallets was less cold than the concrete. The air was insulating him, poorly, but enough to matter. That was March in Austin, so cold wasn't the main problem yet. The main problem was rain, but he filed the pallet experiment away. The spot under the Lamar Bridge he found in late July 2020, when another man who'd been sleeping there moved on. It's a concrete infrastructure cutout, the kind of recessed space where maintenance workers can get under a bridge without going in the water. About 9 feet wide, 14 feet deep, maybe 7 feet of clearance at the highest point, dropping to about 4.5 at the back wall. Open on the south side to Town Lake. Ruben walked up to it and stood there for about 5 minutes before he touched anything. He was reading it the way a combat engineer reads terrain. South-facing opening meant the winter sun would come in low, which was good. No overhead drip line, the bridge deck above extended far enough that rain wouldn't fall straight down into the space. The concrete itself was substantial thermal mass. It would hold whatever warmth it absorbed through the day and release it slowly at night. The north and east sides were solid concrete walls, which blocked wind from those directions. The only exposure was south, into the lake, which meant the wind came from the south in the afternoon and in winter would bring cold air off the water. He needed to block the south face without sealing it entirely sealed completely. It would get damp, and damp was the thing that would kill him faster than cold. The Army had a word for this balance: ventilation. The training said a shelter needs airflow or moisture builds up in the insulation and in the bedding, and then nothing works. You're not trying to build a sealed box. You're trying to build a small enough volume that your body heat matters, with enough ventilation that moisture can escape, with enough blocking that the wind can't strip the warm air away before it does its job. He set up a pallet wall across the south face, 2 pallets wide and 2 pallets high. Not flush with the edges, he left about an 1/8-inch gap on the east side near the top, which became his ventilation point. He oriented the gap east because the prevailing wind in Austin in winter comes mainly from the north and northwest, not from the east. He wasn't sure about this. He hadn't checked weather data. He was going on gut from 2 years living outside and 9 years remembering where wind tends to come from and what it does. He thought it was probably right, and he was right. The foam boards came from a construction site on Barton Springs Road in September 2020. 3-4x, 8 sheets of 2-inch rigid polyisocyanurate insulation, the silver-faced kind with foil on both sides. They'd been sitting in a dumpster for 4 days, slightly scuffed on one face, but otherwise intact. Polyisocyanurate runs about R6 per inch, so 2-inch board is R12 per sheet. He didn't know the specific R value number. He knew it was the same stuff they used to line the walls of refrigerated shipping containers because he'd seen it on a job site years ago and asked a guy what it was. He knew it was extremely good insulation. He pulled 3 sheets. He could barely carry them. He put one on the floor as the sleeping surface, not under a sleeping bag, but directly under it. One went against the north wall, face in. One he propped against the east wall at an angle, creating without planning it as such a second thermal envelope inside the first, a box within a box, an inner air gap between the foam surface and the outer concrete wall, which is one of the most effective passive insulation strategies you can build, and which shows up in modern building science under the name thermal break assembly, or double envelope construction. He didn't have those words for it. He called it double layering. He said later that he learned it in winter survival training, not the technical name, just the principle. If you can put an air gap between the cold surface and the thing you're trying to keep warm, the air gap does more work than almost any material you can find. The thermal conductivity of still air is 0.024 W-MK. The concrete behind the foam board was probably around 1. The foam was around 0.022. The air gap between them added another layer of still air on top of the foam's already low conductivity. He'd built something that a building scientist would recognize as competent work, out of dumpster materials, in a concrete cutout under a bridge, based on training he'd received 27 years earlier. By December 2020, he had the setup dialed in. The sleeping platform on the foam board, the pallet wall on the south face, the foam on the north wall and the east wall, a contractor tarp across the top portion of the south opening, held in place with bungee cords he'd gotten from a gas station clearance rack, angled so rain off the bridge deck would shed away from the interior rather than pooling. A second, smaller tarp, a blue one he'd found near the highway, tucked in at ground level to block the low wind that came off the lake surface at night, which was consistently colder than the wind above it because cold air is heavier than warm air and settles. He knew that too. Cold air pooling. It was in the training always. Make your sleeping position elevated if possible, not because of flooding, but because the coldest air at night is the air at ground level, settling like water into the low points of a space. He'd put the pallets under the foam board, so his sleeping surface was about 6 inches off the concrete floor of the cutout, with 6 inches of air gap below him, full R12 foam board under his body, and still air trapped inside a space small enough that 2 hours after he went to sleep, his own body generating heat the way bodies do, somewhere around 80 watts at rest, had warmed the interior to a temperature he could actually feel. He kept a thermometer. He'd found it in a bag of stuff someone had left near the bridge, one of those small plastic cooking thermometers with a dial face, designed for meat, accurate to maybe 2 degrees. He used it to track the interior temperature on cold nights. On a 35 degrees Fahrenheit night in December, the interior ran about 52 degrees Fahrenheit 2 hours after he got in. On a 28 degrees Fahrenheit night in January 2021, the interior hit 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, but survivable. And survivable is a different number than dead. He told me he used to write the numbers down in a small spiral notebook. He doesn't know what happened to the notebook. He thinks it got wet at some point and fell apart. February 10th, 2021. The temperature in Austin dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit that day, which was unusual enough to make the news, except it was about to get much worse. The National Weather Service had been tracking Winter Storm Uri since at least February 8th. The models were clear about what was coming, but the grid operators at ERCOT, the agency that runs Texas's independent power grid, were either not watching or not acting, and by the morning of February 11th, the generating units were failing because they'd never been weatherized. Gas lines were freezing, coal plants were shutting down. The wind turbines were a convenient target for politicians, but they accounted for a small share of the capacity loss. The failures were mostly thermal generation, mostly gas. Temperatures in Austin bottomed out at 2 degrees Fahrenheit on February 16th. The sustained period of below 25 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures ran from about February 11th through February 18th, roughly 8 days. Ruben was in the bridge cutout for all of it. He'd known it was coming. He'd heard the forecasts from people at the day labor hall on the 9th, and he'd spent the 9th and 10th moving everything back from the outer edge of his space, tightening the tarp attachments, adding a second layer to the pallet wall by pulling 3 more pallets from a nearby alley and wiring them to the existing ones with baling wire he'd been keeping for months against exactly this kind of need. He checked his thermometer. He checked his sleeping bag, an old Coleman bag he'd gotten at a Goodwill on South Lamar in November, rated to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but realistically, probably closer to 30 degrees Fahrenheit after the years it had been through before he found it. He went to H-E-B on the 10th and spent $23 on protein bars, peanut butter, crackers, and 2 boxes of those chemical hand warmers, 10 packs each, 40-hour duration. He wasn't sure the hand warmers would matter, but he bought them anyway. He put the hand warmers inside his sleeping bag at his core, not at his feet, because the training said keep the core warm and the extremities will regulate from there. The feet are a priority, but if you have limited heat sources, core first. The morning of February 13th, the thermometer inside his shelter read 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the official temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd gained 26 degrees Fahrenheit over ambient, with no power, no fuel heat, nothing but his own body, a sleeping bag, the foam board, the pallets, and the 2 tarps. The morning of February 16th, the coldest night. The bottom of the storm, the thermometer read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside was 2 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd gained 39 degrees Fahrenheit over ambient. His hands were cold. His feet were uncomfortable enough that he kept flexing them inside the bag every 20 minutes or so, because the training said keep blood moving in the extremities, don't let anything go numb without paying attention to it. Frostbite starts with numbness, and numbness is the thing you ignore until it's too late. He wasn't frostbitten. He wasn't hypothermic. He was cold in the way that you're cold when it's 41 degrees Fahrenheit inside a sleeping bag, manageable, unpleasant, something you can get through. 2 miles north of him, in a house on Rosedale Avenue that had functioning walls and a legal heating system and a mortgage that was being paid on time, a 71-year-old man named Gerald Walters died on February 16th from hypothermia. His house had dropped to below freezing after 30 hours without power. He had blankets. He had a couch. He had, presumably, a floor that was conducting heat away from his body at somewhere between 6 and 100 times the rate that the air above him was warming it. He didn't have the pallet. He didn't have the foam. He didn't have the 7-year-old memory of a line from a field manual that said 80% of your heat goes to the ground. I keep coming back to that. The gap between them wasn't money. It wasn't resources. It wasn't that Ruben had access to something Walters couldn't have gotten. You can find rigid foam insulation boards in construction dumpsters across every major American city. You can find pallets behind almost any grocery store or hardware store in the country. A $4 bungee cord set from Dollar Tree is not an obstacle. The gap was knowledge. One man had been trained formally, institutionally, at the cost of significant military budget to understand how heat moves and what you do about it. The other man had a house, which meant someone had solved the heat problem for him decades ago, invisibly, inside the walls, and he'd never needed to know how it worked until the house stopped working and the knowledge wasn't there. Now, this is the part where I have to be honest about something, because if I don't say it, this story becomes something it's not. The fact that Ruben knew how to build that shelter and that the shelter worked is not a justification for any of what happened to him. It's not a reason to look at a man sleeping under a bridge and think he's trained. He'll be fine. He wasn't fine. He was alive, which is different. He was alive, and he was 58 years old, and his knee hurt every morning, and he hadn't slept through a full night in 2 years, and he was doing day labor when his knee allowed it, and spending nights in a foam-lined concrete, cutout under a pedestrian bridge. Surviving something and being okay are not the same thing, and there's a harder fact underneath this one. The same training that kept Ruben from freezing also made it harder for him to ask for help. He knew, on some level, that he could handle the physical side of this. The cold, the exposure, he had answers for those. The army had given him answers. And so he stayed outside, managing the manageable thing. While the things that were actually going to kill him, the isolation, the knee that was getting worse, the hearing that was going, the PTSD, that he doesn't talk about much, but that shows up in the conversation as long pauses and redirections, those kept accumulating. Research on homeless veterans documents this pattern so consistently it has a name. They call it the paradox of military training. The same skills that help a veteran survive rough sleeping make them less likely to seek the services that would end it. Independence as a survival tool that becomes a trap, both things at the same time, in the same person, every day. By the time the storm passed, Ruben had been outside for nearly 2 years. He'd survived a pandemic winter outside. He'd survived Uri. He was, by any physical measure, competent at this, in a way that most people housed or not simply aren't. And he was also 58 years old with a bad knee and a bad ear and 2 years of accumulated damage from sleeping on a foam board in a concrete cutout, no matter how well built that cutout was. I want to go back to the physics for a minute, because there's a second thing Ruben knew that I think is even harder to fully absorb than the floor thing, and that's shelter size. FM 3-05. 70 says it plainly. The most common error in making a shelter is to make it too large. The instinct most people have is to want more space, more room to move, more room to breathe, more room to store things. The instinct is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that costs heat directly. A human body at rest produces about 80 watts of heat. Picture an 80-watt light bulb. That's your furnace. Now imagine trying to heat a bedroom with an 80-watt light bulb. You can't. The space is too large. The walls are too far away. The heat dissipates before it can accumulate. But put that 80-watt bulb, meaning you, into a space about 6 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, which is roughly the minimum volume you need to lie down in. And suddenly the math changes. The air in that volume is small enough that your body heat actually matters. You're not heating the room. You're heating a volume that's slightly larger than you are, and that's achievable. Ruben's usable interior space inside the pallet wall was about 8 feet by 5 feet by 4.5 feet at its highest. That's on the larger side for a solo rough sleeper, but the foam on 3 walls was doing work the way an insulated room does, not just blocking cold from entering, but slowing the rate at which the interior air could exchange with the exterior. The critical factor is what building scientists call the air change rate, how fast the interior air is replaced by exterior air. A well-sealed house at 0 wind speed might exchange air once per hour. An unsealed tent in wind might exchange 20 times per hour. Every air change means the heat your body put into that air leaves with it. Ruben's pallet and tarp south wall, with the intentional ventilation gap at the top, was probably exchanging air at somewhere between 3 and 6 times per hour. Not perfect, but manageable. The interior was cooling, but slowly enough that his 80 watts could keep up. He'd figured all of this out not with those numbers, but with those instincts, because he'd been trained to build shelters that conserved body heat, and he'd tested his training over 2 Austin winters before the one that mattered. Here is what happened in a suburb of Austin called Cedar Park on the night of February 15th. 2021. A family of 4 had been without power for 62 hours. They'd done what people do. They'd piled blankets. They'd slept together in one bedroom for warmth. They'd tried the candle trick. Their neighbor, a retired electrical contractor in his 60s named Mark, came over on the afternoon of the 15th and suggested they try the flower pot and candle thing he'd seen online. 4 tea candles under a terracotta pot. He'd read that it created a radiant heater. Tea lights produce between 30 and 40 watts each. 4 of them produced maybe 140 watts total. The house they were trying to heat was roughly 1,800 square feet and sitting at 36 degrees Fahrenheit inside. The pot trick does not work. The pot absorbs heat from the candles and re-radiates it back into the air immediately around the pot. It does not amplify anything. The total heat output of the 4 candles was the same with or without the pot, about 140 watts. which in an 1,800 square foot house that has been losing heat to outside temperatures of 9 degrees Fahrenheit for 62 hours is meaningless. A space heater produces 1,000 to 1,500 watts. They needed at minimum 7 of those heaters running simultaneously just to hold ground, let alone gain temperature. They didn't freeze. They got lucky the power came back on the 16th. But the point is that 4 adults, none of them stupid, none of them irresponsible, turned to a social media physics myth at the exact moment their lives might have depended on real information. Because the real information about heat transfer, about conduction versus convection versus radiation, about volume and insulation and air exchange is not something most people in America have ever been taught. It used to be. It was taught by necessity, in the generations before central heating was assumed. Grandmothers knew which side of the house to gather people on during a cold snap. Farmers knew to get livestock into small pens rather than large barns. The knowledge existed, and then, slowly, it stopped needing to exist, because the furnace handled it, and then it was gone. The military, or at least the parts of the military that still train for cold weather operations, preserved it. Not because someone decided the knowledge was culturally valuable, but because soldiers still operate in places where the furnace isn't there, and men die if the knowledge dies with them. Ruben Salcido carried that knowledge out of the army in 1998 and used it to keep himself alive in a storm that killed 246 people. People who had houses, had walls, had roofs, had every advantage that a permanent structure offers, because what a house is, at its most basic, is an attempt to do what Ruben did manually. Slow the rate at which your body heat escapes to the environment. And when the house's mechanical systems fail, what you're left with is the building envelope, the insulation in the walls, the quality of the windows, the tightness of the construction. A 2022 Pacific Northwest National Laboratory study found that roughly 89% of existing U.S. homes are under-insulated relative to current energy code. Roughly 43% of pre-1992 homes. About 68% of the housing stock have little to no wall insulation. Not inadequate insulation, but no insulation. Walls that are essentially air-permeable barriers between inside and outside. Those houses, in a Uri scale event, fail the way Ruben's concrete cutout would fail if he took the foam boards out. They provide shelter from precipitation, they provide a psychological sense of enclosure, and they conduct heat away from your body until you cannot maintain your core temperature. Ruben's shelter, the one he built from dumpster foam and grocery store pallets, had an effective thermal envelope that was, in that storm, better than a significant portion of the permanent housing in Austin. That's not a compliment to Ruben, and it's not an indictment of homeowners. It's an indictment of a building culture that quietly forgot what a house is supposed to do and relied on cheap gas and abundant electricity to compensate for construction that was never thermal tight to begin with. There's a third thing, and this is the one I find hardest to explain without it sounding like something from a movie, and that's sight-reading microclimate selection. Before Ruben put a single pallet under that Lamar bridge, he stood there for 5 minutes and looked. He was reading the space the way you'd read a topographical map, not for what it was, but for what it did. Which way did water flow if it rained? Where would the sun hit in December, when the angle was low? Where was the wind coming from, and what would block it? What was the thermal mass of the concrete, and how long would it hold the afternoon sun before releasing it at night? This kind of site assessment, reading terrain for thermal advantage before you commit to a position, is part of cold weather military training going back to the Korean War. The Army Northern Warfare Training Center at Black Rapids, Alaska, runs soldiers through this deliberately. You don't put your shelter in the valley floor because cold air is heavier than warm air and sinks, pooling in low spots the way water does. A valley at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit can be 10 degrees colder than the ridge 50 feet above it. South-facing slopes collect more solar energy than north-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere. A south-facing slope in winter gets direct sun. A north-facing slope may not see direct sun for weeks. Dead vegetation and snow accumulation on the windward side of a tree marks the prevailing wind direction, even when the wind isn't blowing. You learn to read those marks and avoid those exposures. In a city, those same reads translate. The south side of a building gets winter sun. The north side stays cold. Concrete and brick hold heat longer than wood. A concrete retaining wall facing south is better thermal mass than a wooden fence facing north. The steam that rises from drainage grates marks heat sources. Low underpasses and drainage channels collect cold air at night. Elevated spots under freeway overpasses stay a few degrees warmer because the cold air drains away from them. The alley between two tall buildings creates a wind tunnel. The right-angle corner where two buildings meet blocks wind from two directions simultaneously and creates a dead air pocket. Ruben read all of this without being aware he was reading it. He walked around the town lake area for 3 days before he settled on the Lamar Bridge cutout. He rejected 2 spots that were geometrically similar because one faced north, too little winter sun, and one sat at the bottom of a slight grade that he could feel. On cold mornings, collected a pocket of colder air that didn't dissipate until after sunrise. He didn't explain this in terms of cold air drainage or thermal inversion. He said, "That one felt colder than it should have. Didn't like it." That feeling is pattern recognition. It's what years of training and deployment in varied terrain produces a read on environment that operates faster than conscious reasoning, because it's been reinforced enough times to become automatic. He didn't reason his way to the south-facing concrete cutout. He saw it and knew. I talked to a structural engineer named Dana Kowalski, who works in Austin and does energy audits of residential buildings. She's been doing this for 22 years. I described Ruben's shelter to her, the foam board placement, the pallet wall, the ventilation gap, the size without telling her who had built it or under what circumstances. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The double envelope is smart. The ventilation gap placement is correct. East side is the right call for Austin's winter wind patterns. The sleeping platform addresses ground conduction, which is the first failure mode in any unheated space. The south-facing opening is correct for passive solar." She paused. "What's the R value of the foam?" I said probably around R12 total. "On a 2-inch poly-iso board." She said, "That's better than a lot of 1970s construction in this city." I then told her the man who built it was a formerly homeless Army veteran who'd done it from materials he found in dumpsters. She said, "That doesn't surprise me, actually. The people who know how to do this right are the people who've had to do it without any of the normal supports. There's no margin for error when you're sleeping in it. You either get it right or you find out immediately. That's the thing. There is no comfort of distance between design and consequence in Ruben's situation. He built the shelter, he slept in it, he felt what worked. If the north wall foam fell down and he didn't replace it, he felt colder. If the tarp angle was wrong and rain got in, his sleeping bag got wet and the insulation collapsed and he nearly died because a wet sleeping bag doesn't insulate. The loft collapses and you've lost your primary heat retention. He fixed problems immediately, not because he was disciplined, but because the alternative was immediate physical suffering. The feedback loop was real and fast and cold. Most American homeowners have never had that feedback loop. The insulation in their walls is doing work they can't see, installed by people they never met, to a code they've never read, in a house that cost them enough money that the idea of its fundamental shelter function failing isn't something they've modeled. The house is presumed to work. When it doesn't, when Uri shows up and the grid fails and the furnace goes quiet, most people don't have the first layer of knowledge they'd need to compensate. They have blankets. They have the internet. They have flower pots. After Uri passed, Ruben was approached by an outreach worker from a nonprofit called Front Steps, which does housing navigation for homeless people in Austin. He'd been approached before and had declined. This time he didn't. He's not entirely sure why. He said, "I think I'd just been outside long enough." He was placed in transitional housing in March 2021. He's in a permanent apartment in South Austin now, a 1-bedroom off Slaughter Lane, which is not the most glamorous address in the city, but it has heat, and it has a door that locks, and it has a floor he doesn't have to insulate. He still thinks about the bridge cutout. Not with nostalgia, he's clear about that, but with a kind of professional interest in what worked. He thinks the foam board on the floor was the single most important element. He thinks he could have done without the east wall foam and been fine. He's not sure the pallet ventilation gap was sized correctly. He thinks it might have been a little too large, bleeding off a few degrees he didn't need to lose. He sounds, when he talks about this, like an engineer doing a post-project review, which is what he is. He was trained to build things that work under bad conditions. He built a thing. It worked. He's reviewing the design. The Army teaches you that the ground is the enemy, he told me. Like, not metaphorically. Literally, the ground will kill you faster than the air will. That's the thing. That's the one thing. Get off the ground. He said a friend of his, a non-veteran who'd been sleeping rough around the same time, used to sleep directly on concrete. They'd had multiple conversations about it. The friend couldn't be convinced. He thought an extra blanket on top was what mattered, and that the floor was just the floor. He got frostbite on his toes in December 2019. Not severe, but real. Lost feeling in 2 of them for about 8 months. Extra blanket on top means nothing if you're lying on concrete, Ruben said. You're losing heat from below. The blanket doesn't know that. It's just sitting there doing nothing for the half of you that needs it. He's right. And the reason he's right, the reason he knew this at all, is that someone, at some point, sat down and wrote it into a field manual, and that field manual was used to train soldiers. And Ruben Salcido was one of those soldiers, and he carried it home. There are 32,882 homeless veterans in the United States right now, according to the January 2024 HUD point-in-time count. That's the lowest number since they started measuring in 2009, and it's still 32,882 people. Of those, roughly 13,851 are unsheltered, meaning they're not in a shelter program. They're sleeping in places not meant for habitation, under bridges, in encampments, in doorways and drainage channels, and the south-facing cutouts of pedestrian bridges. Some portion of those 13,851 people know what Ruben knew. They know the floor is the enemy. They know to keep the space small. They know to read terrain before they commit to a position. They're doing, right now, in cities across the country, a kind of improvised thermal engineering that most people with houses are not equipped to replicate. That's a strange thing to sit with. It doesn't mean being outside is acceptable or survivable. Long term, it absolutely is not. Ruben was alive after Uri, but the mortality data on homeless veterans is brutal. They die on average 20 years earlier than housed veterans, from cardiovascular disease and overdose and cancer, from the accumulated damage of sleeping rough across years that the shelter knowledge can slow but can't stop. The shelter knowledge is not the same as safety. It's just the thing that buys time when everything else has failed. But the knowledge is real, and the gap is real. And the gap goes in a direction that most people's intuitions don't expect. The soldier under the bridge knew how heat moves. The homeowner 3 miles away with the flower pot did not. And in February 2021, in Austin, Texas, that was the difference. I've been thinking about what it would take to close that gap. Not the gap between housed and unhoused. That's a policy problem, a complex one, and there are people working on it, and the numbers are slowly improving. I mean the knowledge gap, the one where most Americans don't know that the floor is the enemy, don't know that you can insulate a 9x1 4 concrete cutout with dumpster foam and grocery store pallets and reduce the temperature differential by 39 degrees. Don't know that the size of a shelter matters as much as the material of it, or that a single sleeping platform, any sleeping platform, changes the fundamental physics of what happens to your body at night. This knowledge used to be common. It was common in every culture that survived winter without central heat, which means it was common everywhere until about 60 years ago. It's still common in rural places where power outages are frequent enough that people have had to think about it. It's common in certain outdoor communities, climbers, mountaineers, wilderness guides, people who've been through NALS or similar programs. And it's common among veterans who were trained in cold weather operations, even if they've never thought of themselves as shelter specialists, even if they never imagined that the training would matter in a city in Texas. Ruben Salcido spent 9 years in the Army and learned something in that time that turned out to be more important than he ever expected, not because he went looking for it, because someone put it in a field manual and a drill instructor made him memorize it, and the knowledge stayed. The field manual is public. The information is available. The principle is simple. 80% of your heat goes to the ground. Get off the ground. Keep the space small. Put air between you and every cold surface. Read where the wind comes from before you pick a spot. It's not complicated. It's just not taught.